Deposit multiplier. The deposit multiplier is the maximum amount of money that the bank can create for each unit of money it holds in reserve. The deposit multiplier involves the percentage of the amount on deposit at the bank that can be loaned. That percentage normally is determined by the reserve requirement set by the Federal Reserve. The deposit multiplier is key to maintaining an economy's basic money supply. It's a component of the fractional reserve banking system, which is now common to banks in most nations around the world. The deposit multiplier is also called the deposit expansion multiplier or the simple deposit multiplier. It's connected to the portion of a bank's deposit that can be lent to borrowers. This lending activity injects money into the nation's money supply and supports economic activity. Essentially, the deposit multiplier is an indicator of how banks can increase or multiply deposit. Central banks such as the Federal Reserve in the United States establish minimum amounts that banks must hold in reserve. These amounts are known as required reserve. Banks must maintain reserve apart from what they loan to ensure that they have sufficient cash to meet any withdrawal requests from depositors. The Fed pays banks a small amount of interest on their reserve, which can be held at the bank or at the local Federal Reserve Bank. The deposit multiplier relates to the percentage of fund in reserve. It provides an idea on how much money banks could create based on what they have to lend after accounting for reserve. Deposit multiplier calculation. The deposit multiplier is the inverse of the percentage of required reserve. So, if the reserve requirement is 20%, the deposit multiplier is 5. Here's how that's calculated. Deposit multiplier is 1 divided by 20. Deposit multiplier is 5. For every $1 a bank has in reserve, it is able to increase deposit and theoretically the money supply by $5 through what it lends. The amount that a bank can lend from its checkable deposit demand accounts against which check, draft, or other financial instrument can be negotiated depends on the Fed's reserve requirements. This is fractional reserve banking at work. If the reserve requirement is 20%, the bank can lend out 80% of money on deposit. Deposit multiplier versus money multiplier. The deposit multiplier is frequently confused with the money multiplier. Although the two terms are closely related, they are distinctly different and not interchangeable. The money multiplier reflects the change in a nation's money supply created by the loan of capital beyond a bank's reserve. It can be seen as the maximum potential creation of money through the multiplier effect of all bank lending. The deposit multiplier provides the basis for the money multiplier, but the money multiplier value is ultimately less. That's because of excess reserve, savings, and conversions to cash by consumers. Banks may keep reserve beyond the requirements set by the Federal Reserve in order to reduce the number of its checkable deposit. This can reduce the amount of new money it injects into the nation's money supply. What is fractional reserve banking? It's a system of banking whereby a portion of all money deposited is held in reserve to protect the daily activities of banks and ensure that they are able to meet the withdrawal requests of their customers. The amount not in reserve can be loaned to borrowers. This continually adds to the nation's money supply and supports economic activity. The Fed can use fractional reserve banking to evac the money supply by changing its reserve requirements. How does the deposit multiplier relate to the money supply? The deposit multiplier is an indicator of how much a bank's lending activity can add to the money supply. Essentially, banks multiply deposit throughout the country by lending money to borrowers who then deposit the money in their own bank accounts. The deposit multiplier represents the amount of money that can be created based on a single unit held in reserves. The higher the Fed's reserve requirement, the smaller the deposit multiplier and the less of increase in deposit created through lending. Thank you.